coalition calls Labor's bluff on its rushed detainee legislation, while teenagers are put under a strict nighttime curfew in Alice Springs. Plus, as Julian Assange's legal drama continues, legendary barrister Geoffrey Robertson will join me live. And listen live right now in a minute to the Mayday warning moments before the terrifying bridge collapse in Baltimore. We're going to cross live to Adam Crichton in the US for the latest.
The whole bridge just fell down. Start is whoever, everybody. The whole bridge just collapsed.
We're going to come back to that and how that all unfolded. But first tonight, we can expose how the Albanese government is operating in secret and is going to extreme lengths to avoid scrutiny and criticism. The government is forcing stakeholders and industry groups to sign non-disclosure agreements, refusing to allow them to bring mobile phones into policy meetings, and for the first time ever, wouldn't trust their own Labor MPs with details on immigration policy. The Prime Minister promised transparency when campaigning for office, and yet his team has become highly secretive. As you know, the coalition today voted against Claire O'Neill and Andrew Giles' immigration laws in the Senate, saying they're rushed and hasty.
They couldn't explain how or when they would use this legislation or who it would apply to. We can't support legislation that hasn't had a case articulated.
But tonight I can reveal that Anthony Albanese doesn't even trust his own federal Labor MPs with information about these laws. I'm told that for the first time, Labor MPs were not given an emailed information pack about the immigration policy prior to caucus. Instead, there were physical printed copies sitting on the chairs. There was no time for Labor MPs to read, digest or understand the policy before caucus. No room for questions or disagreement. Backbenchers are annoyed with how they're being treated by the Prime Minister and his Albanistas. One source told me they don't even trust their own Labor MPs. They refused to email out a caucus brief and instead provided paper copies in the room. MPs are not employees of Toyota. Well, if Albanese is so paranoid that he doesn't trust his own MPs, well, look at how he's treating business leaders, forcing them to sign NDAs. Confidentiality agreements have now become very common under Labor for everything from Tony Burke's workplace laws to Chris Bowen's car efficiency proposals, even to religious leaders over the religious freedom legislation. NDAs are usually used to protect sensitive information, and they've rarely, if ever, been used by governments when discussing policy with stakeholders, with the exception of occasional national security matters. Political veteran Dennis Shanahan writes that the government's ubiquitous use of non-disclosure agreements to gag organisations and keep proposed legislation secret is a travesty of Albanese's pre-election promise of transparency and a corruption of the Rudd government's original intent. It's the antithesis of Albanese's pledge from the opposition benches to operate with transparency and accountability if he became PM.
More transparency and accountability. And that's the basis of what we will take forward.
We need transparency here. We need transparency going forward so that we can maximise opportunities, so that people can have confidence in the transparency and the integrity of our political processes.
Well, it's this broken promise on transparency that's most eroding trust in Labor. As The Australian reports this week, Labor's transparency vow lies bleeding from 1,000 cuts. Shadow Attorney General Michaelia Cash had this to say on Peter Credlin today about the government's secrecy.
This government is without a doubt the most secret of governments Australia has ever seen.
Well, Chris Bowen forced car manufacturers to sign NDAs when he discussed with them his plan to effectively put a tax on cars. His laws will make non-electric vehicles thousands of dollars more expensive than they already are, and we know Cars cost more in Australia than in other parts of the world because of taxes and the high transportation costs. But Chris Bowen's plan for a car tax was to try and rush the transition to electric vehicles. But why the secrecy? If you have so much confidence in your new vehicle efficiency policy idea, then just let it be discussed openly. Instead, he forced the silence of the car manufacturers. They couldn't speak publicly about a policy that directly affects their commercial interests and the public. And then on religious discrimination laws, well, Anthony Albanese stood outside a church in July 2022 and he promised there'd be wide consultation.
Given that we're outside the church today, what are you going to be doing for them?
That I respect people of faith. We will address the issues of religious discrimination and the need to legislate there. We will do that during the term of Parliament. We'll do it in a way which is much more consultative and brings people together in a way that I hope characterises the way that my government functions.
That's a farce. Much more consultative and brings people together. Yet instead of seeing wide consultation or any consultation, some religious leaders like Archbishop Anthony Fisher haven't been consulted at all, while others have been asked to sign NDAs. Well, what does it say about the Prime Minister that he's broken a commitment he made outside of a church? I'll leave you to draw your own conclusions on that. But if the government can't trust religious leaders to look at legislation, then Labor really has hit rock bottom. Business groups also had to sign non-disclosure agreements just to get a seat at the table when Tony Burke's IR reforms were being developed. And this wasn't even to look at the legislation, it was just for briefings. And then business leaders couldn't discuss the proposals with their own members for their feedback. But the whole idea of an NDA is farcical in any case. I mean, would Chris Bowen really sue the boss of Toyota if he spoke about the laws? Then you've got other ministers like Tanya Plibersek who forced stakeholders to leave their mobile phones outside of the room before looking at environmental protection policy. The Nightly reports that Plibersek's Nature Positive plan has been shrouded in secrecy, away from public scrutiny, with industry stakeholders only being briefed in Canberra in lock-up-style sessions where laptops and phones are forbidden. And I've separately confirmed that industry groups weren't allowed to take their mobile phones into these budget-style lock-ups, just a pen and paper. I mean, the whole point of consultation is so that stakeholders can examine proposed legislation, discuss it with their members and discuss it in public for feedback. In the Hawke-Keating era, the ethos was to thrash policy ideas out in the daylight and then settle on the best outcome. But the clear intent of the Albanese government using NDAs is to silence stakeholders for political reasons. It's designed to stop negative coverage in the media and prevent the public from having input into policy. Instead, Albanese and his team want to cook up laws in secret and then impose them on the public as a fait accompli. What we're seeing now is a government that promised transparency to win office, but prefers to operate in the shadows with zero interest in accountability. Well, joining me now is former President of the Victorian Liberal Party, Michael Kroger, and former Labor Cabinet Minister, Graham Richardson. Welcome to you both. Michael, this secrecy of the government, the use of NDAs, the fact that Tanya Plibersek wouldn't allow stakeholders to take their mobile phones even into a briefing on policy, this is all becoming a major problem.
It's rather bizarre, isn't it? I mean, it shows she doesn't trust any of the people she's talking to. It shows a nervousness by the government, given that you probably find in these discussions that a lot of the material being presented by the government knowing the Labor Party in Canberra is probably a bit extreme. They don't want any of these things to leak in case they have to ditch them later on. So it shows the government that's really nervous about what it's talking to people in industry and the community leaders about. So it's another problem for Labor, self-inflicted, and the government appears to be sort of falling apart at all sorts of levels. Now, Albo has to take control of the government. I mean, Howard would never let this happen, and he seems to be leaking. This government are leaking political points at every level, and sooner or later he's got to put his foot down with some of these ministers, Sharri.
Now, I've prepared this report that I just showed you for tonight, but I've just been alerted now to the fact that the chairman of 4 ASX-listed companies, Robert Milner, has just done an interview with the Fin Review where he's speaking about this secrecy, and he's saying that he says he's pulling his hair out. He says the whole thing is madness. He asks why Tanya Plibersek's legislation is being done with such secrecy. This has just landed now in the Fin Review. So, Graham, we've got very powerful figures, business leaders, speaking up publicly to accuse the Albanese government of secrecy, the use of non-disclosure agreements. Have you ever heard of this, Richo?
No, I haven't. This is breaking new ground. Not the kind of ground I'd like to see broken, but that's what it is. I think, the government should have been ready for this, should have been ready for this sort of line of questioning, and should have had a plan. They should have been able to just sweep it wherever they needed to sweep it, under the carpet, over the carpet, who cares, but get it away. And that's something they just haven't been able to do. When you allow these things to just hang around like a bad smell in a lift, you know that it's only going to get worse. It will not get better. Yeah,
the most shocking thing is that there was this promise of transparency that Albanese made over and over again. That's why it wouldn't come as such a shock otherwise, but he promised that he would run a different style of government, Michael Kroger.
Well, he did, but it's an easy thing to promise, and in many respects, though, Sharri, it's an inside the beltway issue. I mean, are people in the suburbs who are down to less than $1,000 of savings and are struggling to pay their mortgages too worried about this? The answer is no, they're not. They probably don't even know about it. So it's not. It's an inside the beltway issue, although it does scare a lot of people. It does. People think, what have they got to hide? I mean, it shows that Albanese is not.
It does affect people because the legislation that they're discussing here, taxes on cars or IR reform, this does affect people, and the public who are members of organisations aren't being consulted. These policy debates aren't happening in the public domain. So it actually does affect people.
Ultimately, it does affect a lot of people. But, if interest rates go down 1%, boy, that'll affect a lot more people. So it's an issue. I don't consider it a first-order issue. I mean, the main problems the government's got is this disaster, these clowns running immigration and home affairs. Bowen has completely lost control of his portfolio. Tony Burke, as has been said tonight, is just a puppet of the union movement. On and on you go. Some of these ministers, this is starting to remind me, Richo, of the Whitlam government. I mean, what they need is to have a conference at Terrigal. That's what the Albanese government needs to have to remind us of the good old days, Graham.
Oh, Richo, this was a pretty disastrous day in Parliament today, especially on the immigration front. Claire O'Neill seen, rushing away from journalists down a corridor. They couldn't get their legislation through. What do you think the government needs to do here?
Tidy itself up and get a better look. It needs a plan. I mean, it just looks too chaotic at the moment. And you can never afford to look like that. I was pretty disappointed in the day today. I thought Labor handled everything badly. It's just one of those days that you want to cross off and not see again. And I hope that's what they can do. But, they're not instilling confidence in people. And governments need to do that. And so I think the government's struggling at the moment. It's got a bit of work to do. Hopefully it'll get its act together and show us from tomorrow on that it can govern properly.
Tomorrow, always another day, as they say. But Richo, do you think at this point Albo's still going to win the next election?
Yeah, he'll bolt in.
Bolt in? Not just minority government? Minority government, surely.
No minority government. He'll have it on his own.
What do you think, Michael Kroger?
Well, I think there's zero chance of that. The best he can do is a minority government, and the way he's going, Dutton will end up with more seats than Albo, and then it's the question of negotiating with the crossbench. But I think the government's struggling. 32% primary vote. That's not good. That's not good. No, I think he's struggling for direction, and he's got these ministers who he can't seem to control, and nor is he prepared to sack them. That's one of his problems.
Richo, if you do look at the actual numbers of the seats, though, the Albanese government only has a majority of 2 seats. I mean, it's pretty likely it's going to lose at least 2 seats across the country. So how do you not think that they'll be in minority government?
Well, I think you can lose a few seats, but you can also win a few. And I wouldn't put that out of the realms of possibility. So I'm looking forward to seeing what we can win, not just what we can lose.
Yeah. What do you think about that, Michael Kroger? I think that it's going to be very hard for the government to retain the number of seats it has now. You look at Queensland, you look at parts of Western Sydney, you look at the Central Coast in New South Wales, not to mention WA. I mean, there was this huge backlash against the Morrison government, against Scott Morrison himself at the last election, which is why the Liberals lost 22 seats. So you think they'd be able to claw back some of them, not enough to win government, but enough to stop Albanese from retaining majority.
Yeah, well, he won't get a majority. He's not going to get 76 seats. I mean, I can see him losing 4 in Perth. There was a 13% swing against the coalition in Perth, so in Western Australia. So that's going to come back. He's going to probably win 4 there. I see him winning Boothby in South Australia. There's a redistribution in Victoria, but he'll win on the current boundaries. He'll win Higgins back. Katie Allen will win Higgins. Manny Cicello will win back Aston. There's a chance of winning Dunkley. He'll lose Lyons in Tasmania. He might lose Blair in Queensland. He'll probably lose Lingiari in the Northern Territory. That fellow Constance will win Gilmore. There's 3 or 4 others in New South Wales. So I don't think he's got a snowflake's chance of being in majority. And I can't see a single seat he's going to win back from the coalition. There's going to be a swing against the government. So the question is, does he get low 70s or mid to high 60s? That's how I see it.
It might be similar to 2010, and they'll have to form a hobbled coalition government with the Teals, God forbid, or the Greens, even worse. What a nightmare. Graham Richardson, Michael Kroger, thank you both so much for your time. Now, Chief Minister of the Northern Territory, Eva Lawler, has announced a 2-week youth curfew for Alice Springs. This is big news today. So this comes after a mob violently rioted through the town. The gang smashed local businesses and cars. It forced parts of the town into lockdown. Frightened locals barricaded themselves indoors. Here was the NT Chief Minister speaking about this today.
The scenes in Alice Springs yesterday were horrific, unacceptable, and we never want to see anything like that again in the Northern Territory. My government will declare an emergency situation in Alice Springs. That means police will have the power to enforce a curfew in the Alice Springs CBD for people who are 18 years and younger.
So this is very strong radical reforms. Let's bring in now Alice Springs Mayor Matt Patterson. Matt, thank you very much for joining me tonight. Look, we've all been shocked for months or even years now at the level of youth crime. Do you think these reforms, as radical as they are, a curfew from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m., do you think these are necessary?
Yeah, look, thanks for having me. This morning I challenged the Chief Minister about decisions in Alice Springs, and what I'll say is I welcome her leadership and the decisions that were made along with the Police Minister's leadership. You know, these changes are certainly not changes that should be celebrated, but they're certainly much needed. I will say, obviously for legal reasons, you need to screen that vision, but I certainly would suggest if you can look at that vision, it's on an Action for Alice Facebook page in Alice Springs, to go have a look at how confronting that is, with people barricaded themselves inside of that premises. And then you can understand, for people who don't know what we're going through, why the emergency declaration was made late this afternoon.
Well, can you tell us about some of the unrest and the lawlessness that's been unfolding, and why haven't police been able to get it under control?
Well, to answer the second part of that question, it's just because we don't have enough police. This is not a criticism of them. They work extremely hard. They spend 80% of their time answering domestic violence cases, which is a tragedy in itself. But what we've seen yesterday is 2 weeks ago, a young man lost his life in a car rollover, and there was a cultural ceremony which was very peaceful. And I don't want to connect them. However, there was a overflow from that ceremony, and we've seen that vision where people attacked the premises, people barricaded themselves in. People then made the way through the Todd Mall with edged weapons and blunt weapons and made their way to council lawns. What I will say about that vision and the confronting nature of it is that was 300 metres away from a preschool and a primary school. And so you've had anywhere from 4-year-olds to 9-year-olds 300 metres away, and that was at school pickup time. So it's very confronting. And unfortunately, over the last few years, that's become a sense of normality.
Yeah. No one should have to live like this. It's astonishing it's taken so long for proper measures to be put in place. We'll see if this 2-week nighttime curfew, 6 p.m. to 6 a.m., we'll see if that works. Matt Patterson, really appreciate your time tonight. And I also want to give credit now to 2 journalists who have been doing extraordinary work on this issue, Ben Fordham on 2GB and Liam Mendes in The Australian. They've really put this issue on the national agenda. And Ben Fordham keeps urging the Prime Minister to go there and to deal with it, and the PM hasn't done enough. Now, coming up, Julian Assange has been in the headlines this week. Well, legendary barrister Geoffrey Robertson will join me live next. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Well, Julian Assange has been thrown a temporary legal lifeline, with the British High Court delaying an immediate extradition to the US by at least 3 more weeks. 2 of the court's justices said they couldn't make a final decision on the WikiLeaks founder's bid to appeal until certain assurances from the US were made. Well, joining me now is human rights lawyer and his former legal advisor, Geoffrey Robertson, KC. Mr. Robertson, thank you very much for your time coming to us from London, morning, of course, where you are. What are your concerns about how this case is playing out?
Well, they've been concerns for a long time. Julian Assange spent 8 years in the Embassy of Ecuador, and a further 5 years, not at his volition, in a prison that is usually used for terrorist suspects. He's not well, and it would have been more effective in terms of British justice had he been dealt with a long time ago. His first hearing, he was judged to be at risk of suicide if he was to be extradited to America, and that was overturned on appeal. Yesterday, if he'd been turned down, he could have been on a plane to New York, but as luck would have it for him, the court decided in his favor that he had 3 strongly arguable grounds of appeal. And then it did something very interesting. It demanded that if America was to be effective, successful, it would have to guarantee that Julian would not be subject to the death penalty. I think that's easy for it to do. But also, and this is the interesting bit, that he would not be discriminated against because he was an Australian, a non-American, and he would have the full force, as Americans have, of the First Amendment. First Amendment, which secures press freedom in America. So that is very interesting, and the American lawyers may have some difficulty agreeing that, for the simple reason that part of their argument against Assange has been that he's not an American, therefore he doesn't enjoy the freedom of the First Amendment. So this is quite a fascinating new point, that the Americans may be hard put to answer. And if they're hard put, the case goes to appeal immediately.
Yeah. Mr. Robertson, you've got a more friendly government to your cause, if I can put it that way, with the Albanese government, and they have been raising this issue with the Biden administration. Even a bipartisan group of politicians travelled to Washington to raise Julian Assange's case. Do you think Albanese should be doing more?
Well, I think he was right to say that it's gone on long enough. And many people, whether they like Assange or not, would heartily agree with that. I remember advising a chap called David Hicks years ago, and the deal was, when the Howard government finally did something to help, was that he would plead guilty to a minor offence, which he wasn't guilty, in fact, but that would get him home immediately. It would save the face of the Pentagon, which is what this opposition is all about. So that is possible with Julian Assange. He's been offered, or he could be offered, what is called a plea deal, to plead guilty to a minor offence, get smacked on the wrist and sent home, home being Australia, Queensland.
Do you expect this will happen? Do you expect Albanese will be able to strike such a deal?
Well, look, I'll tell you what it's all about. Years ago, under the Obama regime, I had a very close contact, very high up. And when I first started to act for Julian Assange, he said to me, look, we don't want him in the American government. We'd have to prosecute the New York Times because they published a lot of his revelations. But the Pentagon do. And the Pentagon usually gets its man. So that's what he's up against. And there is a strong section of the Pentagon that wants to make him wants to use him as a warning to others.
Not to leak national security. Mr. Robertson, you mentioned that public sympathy is divided for Julian Assange, particularly in Australia. I mean, does Julian Assange himself accept that his leaks could have cost lives, could have endangered sources?
This is interesting because it's a very recent, revived allegation. It was dismissed in Bradley Manning's case, Chelsea Manning, as she now is, when the CIA admitted, prosecution admitted, that they couldn't show any. But British barristers now have dressed up their argument with this suggestion. But the important thing to remember, which refutes it, is that all the leaked cables were secret, but not top secret. None of them were classified as top secret, and that is the classification that diplomats have to use if there's any danger of putting lives at stake. So these were cables that were merely secret. They were shared by about 2 million servicemen, including a mixed up 23-year-old. So they, on the face of it, on principle, could not have put lives at stake. This is new allegation dredged by British barristers for their own
Just finally, before you go, Mr. Robertson, as one of the world's leading human rights lawyers, are you concerned about this horrific rise in anti-Semitism that we're seeing that's been virtually unprecedented since the Holocaust?
It is horrific because anti-Semitism is, in my view, the worst form of discrimination. It is subtle. It can draw people in to the most obnoxious hatreds and to violence. It is monstrous, and it has risen. Yes, it has, and it's a tragedy. But it has risen partly because of the action of the Netanyahu government, and that is something that will have to be decided in due course.
Well, I don't think you can excuse or give any justification for the rise in anti-Semitism, and you can't blame Israel for the rise in anti-Semitism. You can't blame what's unfolding in the Middle East for the anti-Semitism that we're seeing here in Australia.
No, of course. But where you have thousands of children being killed, that is one factor in the rise of anti-Semitism, illogical though it may be. So it's a tragedy in many ways.
Geoffrey Robertson, I appreciate your time. Thank you very much. Now, let's bring in Strategic Analysis Australia Director Peter Jennings. Peter, thank you very much for joining me from Canberra. Look, I want to ask you about the conflict that we're seeing between Israel and the United States. The US President Joe Biden clearly walking away from commitments that he made to Israel to support it in its mission to destroy Hamas. Now, the US is very clearly, unequivocally calling for a ceasefire.
Yes, that's right, Sharri. It's a very surprising and quick change. And as far as one can judge, it seems to have more to do with Democrat calculations of the domestic political impact on the Muslim vote in a number of American states in the presidential election. It leaves Israel in a very difficult situation because, frankly, any immediate ceasefire now leaves Hamas to some degree intact, 4 battalions worth of fighters in Rafah in the south of Gaza. And I think, Israel will, regardless of what President Biden is asking for domestic political reasons, Israel is going to prosecute this conflict to achieve its war aim of destroying Hamas's military and political capability. And frankly, I support them in that objective.
Look, a lot of the media, including here in Australia, hold up the United Nations as some sacred body. But have a look at this. The Palestinian representative to the UN, Riyad Mansour, has described Hamas terrorists as brothers during an address after the UN passed its ceasefire vote. Have a look.
All of us are saying immediate ceasefire, and in fact, our brothers and sisters, Egypt, Qatar, are negotiating with the United States and others, and negotiating and mediating with our brothers, Hamas.
I mean, Peter, this doesn't give us much hope that the Palestinian Authority would be a better government of Gaza if they're calling Hamas brothers.
Well, brothers in the sense of Cain and Abel, Sharri, would be how I'd describe it. I mean, let's remember that the Palestinian Authority is essentially the Fatah faction, which Hamas, when it consolidated its power over Gaza, happily killed, lynched them, shot them as they took over power in Gaza. A challenge for Israel here is who do they negotiate with? Hamas is clearly a terrorist organisation and recognised that way by many states internationally, including Australia. The Palestinian Authority has regrettably sympathies towards terrorism and is now, I think we're seeing just a little hint of that in those comments in the United Nations. That's the tragedy for Palestinians, is that their representative bodies at the moment are groups of extremists who continue to want to call for the destruction of Israel. How does Israel attempt to negotiate a two-state solution with either of those groups?
I mean, it seems completely impossible, and they've just officially walked away from negotiations in Qatar, although there are reports that a small Mossad group remains to negotiate the release of the hostages. Peter, we've seen that France has now raised its terror threat level. Very concerning, of course, because the Olympics will be in Paris shortly. But why haven't we had the terror threat level raised in Australia? Clearly, there is a higher threat level since October 7. Anyone can see that. Why do you think the government hasn't done it?
I think having allowed the terror threat level to be reduced, which happened a number of months ago, the government sees this as a very difficult thing to do, to effectively let ASIO, which has the control over this issue, lift the terror threat level. And so what we've had from the head of ASIO, Mike Burgess, is a pretty concerning speech saying that the risk of terrorism remains substantial in Australia. I agree with you. I think it can only be seen to have become more serious, a greater risk as a result of weekly protests, which is kind of almost endorsing the idea that extremism is somehow acceptable. And, you know, this, I think, creates a period of great risk for the Albanese government, because what if something happens? What if there is an incident? That one couldn't rule that out. And yet very clearly right now the government is taking a sort of a light-handed approach to managing these street protests, which I think is entirely the wrong strategy.
All right, Peter Jennings, thank you very much for joining me this evening. Now, coming up, another day of chaos in Parliament as the Coalition calls Labor's bluff on its rushed detainee legislation. My political panel will join me to debate this next. Welcome back. Well, there was another day of chaos in federal parliament today. The emergency removal powers for non-citizens, these detainee laws, were voted down in the Senate by both the Coalition and the Greens for different reasons, very different reasons, instead referred to a parliamentary Senate inquiry. The opposition said they won't be rushed to pass the laws and they want to make sure the government gets the legislation right. Home Affairs Minister Clare O'Neil then held a press conference where she accused the Coalition of playing politics.
Now, instead of working with us, as one would expect parliamentarians to do, instead the Liberals have come forward and they've said no. They've said no again. And what we see is a consistent pattern emerging here where our government brings forward national interest propositions and Peter Dutton, Dr. No himself, comes forward and plays political games and stops us from doing things that are important for the welfare of our country.
All right, let's bring in our Wednesday political panel. And tonight we've got Nationals MP Keith Pitt and Labor MP Daniel Molino. Welcome to you both. Look, Keith, the Deputy Liberal leader Susan Ley in question time today asked several questions of Clare O'Neil about whether she'd reduced the Home Affairs Secretary Stephanie Foster to tears. She asked whether it was the case that she was visibly upset after a meeting in Clare O'Neil's office. What does the Coalition know about this?
Oh, Sharri, we've all seen the media reports today about these allegations of what sounds like pretty poor treatment, to be honest. But never forget where this came from. We've seen, what's this, the fourth lot now of urgent legislation that desperately has to be provided and done because Labor simply can't manage what's happening in terms of our borders. Firstly, it was the court's fault. Then there needed to be urgent changes. Then they didn't do it. It wasn't their fault. And now we've seen there's even more changes required. I mean, we've got the crossbench claiming that they had 20 minutes to look at this legislation. And we've seen a release that confirms these detainees that are now in the community are murderers, have been criminal offences for sexual assault, serious assault. This is a real challenge, but the only thing that is super clear here is they've been released by the Labor Party into the community, and Minister Giles and Minister O'Neil are clearly out of their depth and they should be removed.
Mm-hmm. Daniel, has the government been caught in a contradiction here? Both at the same time simultaneously claiming that this legislation needed to be rushed through and yet also saying that there was no reason for it to go ahead right at this moment, at this point in time.
No, well, hi, Sharri. And look, I think what's clear is that the government has argued a case strongly in the High Court and the court's decided a certain way. So right from the start, this has been a reaction by the government to comply with a High Court decision. What we saw with the previous tranche of legislation setting up the Community Protection Tribunal was that that was a piece of legislation that was urgent. We worked with the opposition in good faith. They put forward some amendments, some of which we accepted, and that piece of legislation was passed with the urgency that it warranted. What we saw today and yesterday was that this is a matter where occasionally it is going to require urgent action by the government. On this occasion, I think it's pretty clear that the opposition didn't deal with the government in good faith and frankly is dealing with this as a political issue at this point in time. The Australian public deserves the government and frankly the opposition to be dealing with issues like this of national importance in a way that is in the national interest.
Look, Keith, do you want to respond to that? Because I know the Coalition has been arguing that they should have had more time to look at this legislation, although it is curious that the Coalition voted for the laws yesterday, but then against them today in the Senate. So they passed them through the House of Reps, but they're not in the Senate.
Well, I think Mr Molina makes a good point. The Labor Party is all reaction. It's all reactive. It's not proactive. And we've worked with the government previously. And you know what happened, Sharri, it's pretty straightforward. The time it takes to get across to the Senate, then have the debate there, gives us more time to look at a legislation which we had for literally minutes. In fact, some hours. It certainly wasn't days or weeks. And never forget that this legislation is proposing things like eliminating some countries. These are very serious changes. We want to take them seriously. And you know, we're happy to recall the Parliament. There's no challenges with any of that. The Labor government is able to do it. We stand ready.
Yeah, don't see why you politicians should get 6 weeks off when everyone else has to work. Look, Ben Fordham had a fiery clash with NDIS Minister Bill Shorten this morning. Have a listen.
We brought you an example in April last year relating to video game therapy, and you said, look, that's not what the NDIS is for people playing Dungeons and Dragons and Minecraft. They're still doing it. That was April last year. It's still being offered today, Bill.
Well, today in Parliament, I'm bringing forward legislation which is going to clean up a lot of that.
What? It's March 27, 2024. I told you about it in April 2023.
Ben, first of all, when you propose changes to the NDIS, you've got to talk to people. I know that in the simple world, you just sort of try and fix everything straight away, and I do quite a lot. But sometimes you've just got to talk to people about changes.
Daniel, the public has been shocked at how taxpayer funds for the NDIS are being used, including video games and strip clubs.
So can I just go back to first principles here? And I just wanted to say that firstly, the NDIS rightly is going to be amended, and this comes off the back of a couple of really big reviews. But look, I talk to people in my community every day for whom the NDIS makes a huge difference in their lives. We need to crack down on fraud, and we need to tighten some aspects of the NDIS. But I just want to start from the basis that most of the operators in the NDIS are working very well for the people that they help. Secondly, look, the issue that is being talked about here is a complex issue. So the NDIS was revolutionary, in my opinion, in a very good way, in that it was moving the system towards agency and autonomy for people with a disability. Like, this was really groundbreaking and important. What we have is a system that has given hundreds of thousands of people more agency and autonomy. But it is true that we need to clarify what it means for something to be reasonable and necessary. The thing is, we've got hundreds of thousands of people with plans. And what the Minister said today in the chamber, and I was there for the second reading speech, is that we've got to adjust this system over a transition and in a way that protects people who are relying on this system.
Look, we're out of time, but yeah, there's a lot of problems with it, including cost blowouts. Daniel Molino, Keith Pitt, I really appreciate you joining me this evening. Now, after the break, crews have sadly suspended search and rescue efforts for 6 workers after the Baltimore Bridge collapse. Adam Crichton in the US will join me with the latest. Well, to some breaking news now. I'm just learning that Senate estimates hearing tonight, right now, has just heard that 73 out of the 152 of the detainees are not wearing ankle bracelets. So 73 of the 152 released detainees are not wearing ankle bracelets. This was part of the original legislation that the detainees were meant to be monitored with ankle bracelets. It was one of the conditions that the Coalition insisted on when they supported Labor's legislation. This revelation just right now in a Senate estimates hearing tonight. This is going to be big news tomorrow. You're hearing it here right now first. All right, let's return now to last night's Baltimore Bridge tragedy, where search and rescue efforts for 6 workers have been suspended. The Australian's Washington correspondent Adam Crichton joins me now. Adam, this is very sad. What else do we know? What's the latest here?
Well, look, the latest indeed is that they have called off the search for those poor construction workers, as you say. So 2 of them survived, which is a miracle, really, given the conditions below. I mean, it's something like a 40-metre fall from that span. So authorities have launched a safety probe into what happened, but it is more and more looking like just a tragic accident. So the engine of the ship lost power just a few minutes, apparently, before it crushed into the bridge. And so really, given those circumstances, there's actually not much that could have been done.
I mean, we heard the Mayday call that was released today. So there was a warning which did end up saving lives. It stopped traffic. When we went to air last night, we expected that this was going to be a much greater disaster based on what authorities were telling us. They were calling this a developing mass casualty event. But it's so lucky that that Mayday call went out. Here it is. Have a listen.
Indeed.
And hold all traffic on the Key Bridge. There's a ship approaching. It just lost their steering. So until you get that under control, we got to stop all traffic.
13 dispatch. The whole bridge just fell down. Start, whoever, everybody. The whole bridge just collapsed.
Now, let's turn to the US election. Adam, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., you've been following his political path closely. He's now chosen a running mate. Is this going to help him? Because he seems to be getting a lot of support.
Well, actually, this choice has been almost universally panned, I would say, the choice of his vice presidential running mate. So this is a woman called Nicole Shanahan. She's practically a billionaire because she was married to one of the founders of Google, Sergey Brin, and she divorced him a couple of years ago and got a large payout. Look, I mean, from my monitoring of the response, it was very bad for RFK. Indeed, he has been going okay. He's been polling about between 10 and 15%, I would say, nationally. But this lady, she's an IP lawyer. She's an attorney from the Bay Area. She's very well connected with Silicon Valley. She doesn't really fit his image, I would say, of being against the establishment. And I think that was, that's what generated all of the criticism, I would say, yesterday. So, look, remains to be seen. She seems a very nice woman. She's very intelligent. She's very successful in her own right. But yes, it certainly wasn't well received by his supporters.
What about RFK's political prospects, though? Because he is getting a lot of support for an independent. But is there any option that you foresee where he could become a serious presidential candidate?
Well, certainly he could. I mean, he is polling very well in some of the marginal states in the US. I mean, up to 30%, 35% in Arizona and Nevada. He's very popular amongst young people. So there is a chance that he could win 1 or 2 states in November. But I think the big likelihood now, and especially in light of his VP choice, which is a fairly left-wing choice, I would say, is that the Biden administration is very concerned because Joe Biden is going to lose votes to RFK almost certainly now, and so that means that it's more likely, for Trump to win states. That is the likely outcome. So certainly you saw yesterday lots of cheering on the Trump side with this choice of his, and lots of concern on the Democrat side.
Look, just quickly, we've seen that Trump has managed to reduce the amount of bond money to just $175 million. Where is this headed?
Well, look, he's very lucky. I mean, he's going to pay the bond, and I fully expect that he's going to appeal that case all the way to the Supreme Court. And there's a very good chance, I think, that that he'll win. I mean, of course, the original penalty still stands, the $450 million, and it's an enormous penalty, especially given there were really no victims. And so, I think this is, the decision has helped him. Well, firstly, the penalty has helped him very much politically, and in the short term, so has this decision from the appeals court.
Yeah. All right, Adam Crichton, we're out of time. Thank you very much for joining me in Washington. And I'll see you tomorrow at 8. And here's my mate, Paul Murray.